Well, welcome to your first lecture for Bio 156, which is Intro to Biology for Allied Health Majors. And the first thing we're going to talk about, since this is a biology class, is what biology is. If you're familiar at all with the roots of words, you might know that bio is a root word that refers to anything of life, and ology means the study of. So biology literally means the study of life. So first questions first, what exactly is life? Well, if we look at some of the key features that identify life or that identify living organisms as separate and different from non-living objects, it's tough at first to find differences because in a lot of ways non-living and living things are very similar. They're both made up of these things called atoms and molecules, which we're going to be talking about in the next couple weeks. And it turns out they're made up of a lot of the same atoms and molecules, things like carbon and oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, manganese, phosphorus, sodium. You find all of those different things in tables and in people and in birds and in houses. So living and non-living things also obey some of the same physical and chemical laws. Again, it makes it a little bit more challenging to figure out, well, just what exactly is a living organism and what isn't. On the next few slides, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but in the interim, I'd like to point out that the cell is the smallest unit of life. In a few weeks, we're going to be learning all about what a cell is and what are the component parts of a cell. We know that lots of cells can frequently get together and coordinate together to produce a multicellular organism like a bird or a sunflower or a mushroom. But we also know that there are some cells out there that function perfectly well all on their own as a single-celled organism, things like that paramecium you see right down here, and bacteria as well. So, let's talk a little bit about what are the things that make something living. And this all relates to something called emergent properties. And emergent properties really are all about qualities or characteristics of things that emerge or come about as they become more complex. And they're frequently things we would not necessarily predict would appear if we just looked at the individual parts. And I'll give you an example of this. If you saw a car for the first time only as a bunch of metal pieces spread out along the floor of a mechanic's garage, you might not ever think that if those parts were put together in the proper way that they produce this machine that would be able to drive 100 miles an hour and take people from point A to point B. That's an example of where the composite pieces and parts actually, when put together, create something greater than you would anticipate. That's what emergent properties are. And if we look at living organisms, for example, we know that all living organisms start out made up of atoms, things like oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, helium, and those atoms come together to form molecules like water, which is H2O, or methane, or they might make a molecule of glucose, or a molecule of a protein, or DNA, for example. And then all of those different molecules together create functional cells. And the properties of those cells as living organisms are emergent properties. They're properties we wouldn't normally predict to see just from a bunch of molecules getting together. Okay, so the sum or the total is greater than the individual parts. If we look beyond that, cells coordinate together to make tissues. We're going to learn about tissues near the end of the semester in this class. Tissues coordinate together to form functional organs, which is the topic of Bio 201 and 202, Anatomy and Physiology 1 and 2. We can have organs coordinate together to form organ systems, like you and I are each an organ. We are an organism which is made up of a bunch of organ systems. Organ systems can be things like the respiratory system, which includes your lungs and your trachea and your nostrils, etc. or say your digestive system with your stomach and your esophagus, large intestine, small intestine, pancreas, liver, gallbladder, all of that. So organ systems coordinate together to make a full organism. Organisms, when you get a group of them all together of the same type of organism, you create a population. And when you get a bunch of different populations of different organisms together coexisting in an area, a geographic area, you create a community. And from here, when you get several communities together, you create an ecosystem. And when we take the sum composite of all the ecosystems present, we create the biosphere, which is the entire planet Earth. So you can see that as we go from the smallest thing, from an atom, all the way up through biosphere, we see that each level gets more and more complex, and that the complexities of that level are greater than the sum of the complexities from the previous level. So you constantly get these emergent properties. Things become more and more complex. So let's talk very briefly about what the basic characteristics are for all living things. And I want to remind you that your textbook is a source you should be relying on reading to help solidify your understanding of this information. You can either read your textbook first and then listen to these lectures, or you can do the reverse. Listen to the lectures first and follow up with reading the book, but you need to do both. One is not sufficient. In your textbook, you're going to see that there's some discussion of the basic characteristics or requirements of all living things. In other words, what are the things that make or define an organism as being alive? And they fall into three general categories. All organisms, living organisms, have to have some sort of energy source, and they usually collect materials to use as that energy source. They have to reproduce, and they also grow and develop. And sorry about that. And then they also have to adapt to their natural environment. And this is the process of natural selection that we're going to be talking about in a couple of weeks when we get to the topic of evolution. So let's look first here at energy. Energy, by definition, is the capacity to do work. And the quintessential example of energy that we know of here on planet Earth is to look up at the sky at the sun. The sun is the ultimate source of all energy for nearly everything that lives on planet Earth. Now, there are a few bizarre exceptions to that rule, a few unicellular microorganisms, some types of bacteria that are able to exist on other energy sources. But for the most part, all organisms rely on the sun, either directly, like plants do, to generate the energy they need to make sugar through a process called photosynthesis, or they rely on the sun indirectly by doing like what this buffalo is doing here in the bottom right-hand corner of this picture, which is consuming grasses that have already utilized the sun as an energy source. So when organisms manufacture food, or when they get food from their environment, when they get nutrients from their environment, they utilize a bunch of different molecules inside their cells, some things called enzymes that we're going to learn about shortly, to undergo a bunch of different kinds of chemical reactions to try to basically harness the energy in the food and the nutrients that they've eaten, to find a way to extract that energy and use it for their own purposes. That process, all those different chemical reactions that occur inside a cell, is called metabolism. And metabolism is going to be the topic of one or 2 weeks worth of discussion in our class this semester. And one topic we're going to touch on now, and we'll touch on it a whole bunch more near the end of the semester, is this topic of homeostasis. In homeostasis, basically, there's this internal drive of any organism to maintain a status quo or a set point in lots of different things. And I can give you some great examples of that. We all know that our body temperature stays relatively constant throughout the day. That's an example of homeostasis. We also happen to have a certain level of sugar in our blood that's more or less stable at all times. Another example of homeostasis. So there's lots of examples of these. We'll discuss this more near the end of the semester. Let's talk real quick about a couple of the other characteristics of living things. Living organisms have the ability to note changes in their environment and to respond to those changes. Responding to change is essential to staying alive, okay? If a predator shows up 10 feet away from you, you've got to be able to respond to get out of the way of that predator so you don't become lunch. Plants even respond to change. If you use time-lapse photography, you can actually show or see that, for example, plant leaves will tilt to follow the sun as it moves across the sky in order to benefit maximally from sunlight that it's collecting. So anytime you have a collection of responses that an organism has to its environment, those collections of responses are called behavior. Now, we also mentioned that there were a few other characteristics of living things. We know that all organisms live and they eventually die. We also know that they also reproduce. That's, since organisms die, individual organisms die, the only way to sustain the population in the years to come is to reproduce, to produce offspring like this cute little penguin you see in this picture here. Now, multicellular organisms like us begin the process of reproduction with the production of something called gametes. And examples of gametes or sex cells include things like sperm and egg. Unicellular organisms, the process of reproduction is a little simpler, and we'll get to that in a couple weeks. Now, the interesting thing about that process of reproduction, it's really about passing on DNA. DNA is another topic we're going to cover extensively during this semester, because that's where we keep or house all the recipes for how we make an individual organism. And that DNA is housed on something called chromosomes that we'll talk about later. Okay, just a couple more things to say about living organisms, and then we'll wrap up this first part of your lecture. There's 2 more parts after this one. I said earlier in the lecture that of the 3 major parts that all living organisms have, the third part was their ability to adapt to their environment. And again, I said that that was absolutely critical, because if you can't adapt to a changing environment, you're most likely going to die. Now, what's interesting is that if the environment changes very gradually, the organisms in that environment through multiple generations can also change to be best adapted or best suited to that environment. Again, this is the topic of natural selection and evolution, which we'll get to in just a couple weeks. But even when we look at all the variety of diversity, of all the different living organisms that are out there on planet Earth, we know that there are some very key and fundamental similarities, things like we've talked about already: needing energy, acquiring nutrients, reproducing, adapting to the environment, maintaining homeostasis, ability to respond to changes. Those are all characteristic things that make organisms, by definition, living. Remember those emergent properties that we talked about. Later on, we're going to talk about what happens over the course of generations as we have changes occurring in populations over generation after generation. And this is the process of evolution, and it's caused by a mechanism called natural selection that we'll talk about later. I'm going to stop there, wrap up part 1 of this lecture. I will see you in part 2.